Sometimes the greatest miracles happen when a man believes he has nothing left to lose. The rain hammered the red clay earth of San Miguel, New Mexico, turning the ancient cemetery into rivers of mud beneath Father Michael Hartley's knees. He'd driven 8 hours through the storm to reach this forgotten place where his grandmother once prayed, desperate for answers that his empty church back in Denver couldn't provide. The wooden cross before him, weathered and scarred by decades of desert wind, seemed to mock his tears as he whispered accusations at God for taking his sister Sarah in that terrible accident 6 months ago. "Don't cry, sir," came a small voice through the thunder. "You can pray with my mom." Michael looked up to see a boy, maybe 7 years old, standing in the downpour without getting wet. The child's dark eyes held an impossible kindness, and his hand, warm and solid, reached out to help the broken priest to his feet. What Father Michael didn't know was that this simple invitation would lead him into a night that would shatter everything he thought he knew about life, death, and the mysterious ways grace finds us in our darkest hours. But who exactly was this boy? And why did his mother's adobe house feel like coming home to a place Michael had never been? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Michael's hand trembled as the boy's fingers closed around his own, fingers that should have been ice cold from the storm but radiated warmth like embers from a winter fire. The child couldn't be more than 7, with dark hair plastered against his forehead and clothes that seemed untouched by the deluge soaking everything else in sight. "What's your name?" Michael managed, his voice hoarse from hours of anguished prayer. "Samuel," the boy said simply, tugging gently at the priest's hand. "Mama's making coffee. She said you'd be cold." The words struck Michael as odd. How could the child's mother know he was coming when he hadn't even known himself until he'd pulled off Interstate 25 3 hours ago, following road signs toward this remote village that existed more in memory than on any current map? But grief had a way of making everything feel surreal, and Michael found himself rising to his feet, mud clinging to his black pants and rain-soaked collar. "Is your mother expecting me?" he asked, but Samuel was already leading him away from the cross, their footsteps squelching through the saturated earth between weathered headstones. The cemetery gave way to a narrow dirt path that wound between adobe houses, their thick walls glowing amber in the occasional lightning flash. Most of the windows were dark, and Michael wondered if anyone still lived in this place that felt suspended between decades. His grandmother had spoken of San Miguel often during his childhood, describing a community where faith ran as deep as the mountain springs, but that was 40 years ago. People moved away. Towns died. Only the desert remained. Samuel moved with surprising confidence through the storm, never slipping on the treacherous mud, never pausing to get his bearings. He chattered as they walked, his voice somehow carrying clearly despite the thunder rolling across the valley. "Mama says priests carry special sadness," he said, glancing back at Michael with those impossibly old eyes. "She says it's because they feel everyone's pain, not just their own." Michael's throat tightened. 6 months ago he would have agreed. 6 months ago he'd believed his calling was to shoulder the burdens of his parishioners, to be a conduit for God's comfort in times of suffering. But that was before the accident, before Sarah's funeral, before the endless nights staring at his bedroom ceiling, wondering if the prayers he'd offered for decades had ever traveled beyond the church rafters. "Your mother sounds very wise," he said, though the words felt hollow. "She is. She knows lots about sadness." Samuel stopped before a small adobe house with a red wooden door and windows that glowed with warm yellow light. "She's been waiting for you." "Waiting for me specifically?" Samuel nodded solemnly. "She said a broken shepherd would come in the storm. She said he'd need to remember that even shepherds sometimes get lost." The boy's words sent a chill through Michael that had nothing to do with his rain-soaked clothes. He'd told no one about his crisis of faith. His bishop thought he was taking a few days of personal retreat. His housekeeper believed he was visiting family. Yet this child spoke as if his mother could see straight into Michael's soul. Thunder crashed overhead, and Samuel pushed open the red door without knocking. "Mama, I brought him!" Warmth spilled out into the storm, not just heat, but something deeper. The scent of coffee and wood smoke, the golden glow of candles, the feeling of sanctuary that Michael remembered from his childhood but hadn't experienced in his own church for months. He hesitated on the threshold, suddenly aware of how he must look, a middle-aged priest caked with mud, eyes red from weeping, hair disheveled by wind and rain. "Come in, Father," a woman's voice called from somewhere inside. "You'll catch your death in this weather." The phrase struck him as oddly phrased, but Samuel was already tugging him across the threshold. The door swung shut behind them, muffling the storm to a distant murmur. Michael found himself in a small living room with whitewashed walls, wooden furniture worn smooth by generations of use, and religious icons that seemed to watch him with knowing eyes. "Mama's in the kitchen," Samuel said, disappearing through a doorway strung with wooden beads. Michael stood dripping on the saltillo tiles, taking in details that felt both foreign and familiar. The house radiated age, not decay, but the deep settledness of a place where countless prayers had been offered, where sorrow and joy had soaked into the very walls. It reminded him of his grandmother's stories, of the faith that had sustained desert communities through drought and hardship. But more than that, it reminded him of something he'd lost without realizing it. The bone-deep certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be, for the first time in months. The crushing weight of guilt and doubt seemed to lift slightly from his shoulders. "Don't be shy, Father," the woman's voice called again. "The coffee's getting cold, and we have much to discuss before morning comes." Michael hesitated at the beaded doorway, droplets still falling from his sodden cassock onto the worn tiles. The kitchen beyond glowed with candlelight, casting dancing shadows that made the carved santos on the walls seem to breathe. He could hear the gentle clink of ceramic against wood, the soft humming of what sounded like an old Spanish hymn his grandmother used to sing while making tortillas. This wasn't his world, not anymore. His world was St. Catherine's Parish in Albuquerque, with its modern rectory and digital sound system, its committee meetings and budget spreadsheets. His world was the comfortable routine he'd built over 23 years of priesthood: morning mass at 7, office hours until noon, hospital visits in the afternoon, evening prayers before bed. A life of structured purpose that had once felt like a calling but now seemed more like an elaborate performance. He thought of his housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, who would arrive at the rectory tomorrow morning to find his breakfast dishes unwashed in the sink. She'd worry. She always worried when his routines were disrupted. "Padre Miguel," she'd say in her gentle way, "you work too hard. You need to eat more, sleep more, laugh more." But how could he explain that food had lost its taste, that sleep brought only dreams of twisted metal and Sarah's final words? His assistant pastor, Father Thomas, would handle the morning mass. At 2008, Thomas still possessed the bright certainty Michael remembered from his own early years. The young priest would stand at the altar with unwavering conviction, offering comfort to parishioners who sought guidance from their broken shepherd. The irony wasn't lost on Michael. His congregation came to him with their doubts while his own faith crumbled like adobe walls in a flash flood. "Father!" Samuel's voice called from the kitchen. "Mama's waiting." Michael pressed his palm against the wooden beads, feeling their smooth warmth. In 6 hours his alarm clock would ring in an empty bedroom. Mrs. Rodriguez would knock on his door, then use her key when he didn't answer. By noon his bishop would know he was missing. By evening there would be search parties, phone calls to hospitals, worried faces asking questions he couldn't answer even if he were there. But for the first time in months, the thought of disappointing others didn't paralyze him. Standing in this threshold between worlds, Michael felt something he'd almost forgotten: curiosity. When had he stopped being curious about the mysteries of faith and started simply administering them like medicine? When had his prayers become recitations instead of conversations? He pushed through the beaded curtain. The kitchen was smaller than his office bathroom, with rough-hewn vigas supporting the ceiling and a wood-burning stove that filled the space with gentle heat. Clay pots lined open shelves, and dried herbs hung in bundles that perfumed the air with sage and oregano. At the center stood a woman whose age seemed as fluid as candle flame, perhaps 40, perhaps 60, with dark hair braided down her back and hands that moved with the grace of someone accustomed to making much from little. "Father Michael," she said without turning around, ladling coffee from a pot into 3 mismatched cups. "I'm Maria Santos. Thank you for coming so quickly. How did you know my name?" "Samuel told me." She smiled, and Michael noticed she hadn't answered his real question. "Please, sit. You must be exhausted." The wooden chair creaked as he settled into it, suddenly aware of how bone-deep tired he was. Not just from the drive or the storm, but from months of carrying weight he couldn't set down. His daily schedule back home was packed with obligations, but none of them fed his soul anymore. Morning mass felt like theater. Counseling sessions became exercises in offering advice he didn't believe. Even his private prayers had become desperate pleas shouted into an empty sky. Maria set a cup before him, the coffee so dark it looked like liquid night. "You've traveled a long way. 3 hours. From Albuquerque?" "I meant longer than that." Her eyes held the same ancient quality as her son's. "Samuel says you've lost your way." Michael's hand tightened around the warm ceramic. Tomorrow, parishioners would arrive at his office seeking guidance. Mrs. Patterson would want to discuss her husband's drinking. The Morales family would need help planning their daughter's quinceañera. Teenagers from the youth group would seek advice about college, careers, calling, all of them trusting that their priest had answers, that his faith remained unshaken while theirs wavered. "I should go," he said suddenly, starting to rise. "People are expecting me." "Are they?" Maria asked quietly. "Or are you expecting you?" The question stopped him mid-motion. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the village, but inside this small kitchen, surrounded by the tangible presence of faith that lived in clay and candlelight rather than doctrine and duty, Michael felt something crack open in his chest, not breaking, but beginning to breathe. "The coffee really is getting cold," Samuel said from the doorway, grinning. Despite everything, Michael smiled. "Then I suppose we'd better drink it." Michael lifted the cup to his lips, savoring the bitter warmth that seemed to chase away months of internal cold. The coffee was unlike anything he'd tasted, rich and complex, with an earthy undertone that spoke of beans roasted over wood fires and ground by hand. As he drank, he found himself studying Maria's face in the candlelight, trying to place the nagging sense of familiarity that tugged at the edges of his memory. "This is remarkable," he said, gesturing to the cup. "Where do you get coffee like this?" Maria smiled, settling into the chair across from him with her own steaming cup. "My husband brought it back from Guatemala before Samuel was born. I've been saving it for a special occasion." "And my arrival constitutes a special occasion?" "The arrival of anyone seeking truth is special, Father, especially one who's forgotten how to find it." Samuel had perched on a wooden stool near the stove, swinging his legs and watching the adults with the patient attention of a child accustomed to late-night conversations. The scene felt impossibly domestic, as if Michael had stumbled into someone's private world and been welcomed without question. It was a sensation he hadn't experienced since his childhood visits to his grandmother's house, before the weight of vocation and responsibility had settled on his shoulders. "How long have you lived here?" Michael asked, settling deeper into his chair despite the voice in his head that still urged him to leave, to return to the safety of his scheduled life. "All my life," Maria replied. "My family built this house in 1952 after the drought drove us down from the higher mountains. 3 generations have prayed in this kitchen." "And Samuel's father?" A shadow passed over Maria's face, brief but unmistakable. "Gone these 7 years, mining accident up in Colorado." "I'm sorry. Death is not the end, Father. You know this." The certainty in her voice made Michael's chest tighten. Once, he would have offered the same comfort to grieving parishioners, the promise of resurrection, of reunion, of love that transcended the grave. But since Sarah's funeral, those words had turned to ash in his mouth. How could he promise others what he no longer believed himself? Lightning illuminated the small window above the sink, followed immediately by thunder that shook the adobe walls. The storm showed no signs of abating, and Michael realized he might be stranded here until morning. The thought should have filled him with anxiety. He had responsibilities, obligations, a parish that depended on his presence. Instead, he felt something approaching relief. "Tell me about your sister," Maria said quietly. The coffee cup slipped in Michael's hands, nearly spilling across the scarred wooden table. "What?" "The one you're carrying." Her dark eyes held no judgment, only compassion. Samuel sees these things sometimes, the weight people carry. Michael's throat constricted. He hadn't spoken Sarah's name aloud since the funeral, hadn't allowed himself to examine the guilt that had been eating him alive for 6 months. But something about this kitchen, about Maria's gentle presence and Samuel's knowing gaze, made the words come unbidden. Her name was Sarah. She was driving to see me when it happened. I'd called her that morning, told her I was having doubts about my vocation. She dropped everything, drove 3 hours in a snowstorm to talk me through it. The roads were icy, visibility was poor, but she came anyway because her big brother needed her. The candle flames wavered as if touched by an invisible breath. Samuel had stopped swinging his legs and was listening with the solemn attention of someone far older than his years. "She never made it to the rectory," Michael continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "State Patrol found her car wrapped around a tree 20 miles outside Albuquerque. If I hadn't called, if I'd handled my crisis like a priest instead of a frightened child, she'd still be alive. She'd still be raising her daughters, still be married to David, still be what, Father?" Maria's voice was gentle but insistent. "Still be everything I'm not. Strong, faithful, certain." Samuel slipped from his stool and approached the table, his small hand finding Michael's wrist. "Mama says certainty isn't the same as faith. She says faith is what you hold on to when you can't be certain of anything." The boy's touch was warm, almost electric, and for a moment Michael felt something shift inside him, not healing exactly, but a loosening of the knot of guilt he'd carried for so long. He looked from Samuel to Maria, seeing something in their faces that made his breath catch. "Who are you people?" Maria set down her cup with a soft clink that seemed to echo longer than it should have. "We're the ones who've been waiting for you, Father. The question is, are you ready to learn why?" Outside, the storm reached a crescendo, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to toll midnight. But Michael no longer heard the wind or rain. All his attention focused on Maria's words and the choice they implied, the choice between the safe emptiness he'd known for months and something vast and unknown that waited just beyond his understanding. The church bell's final toll faded into silence, leaving only the storm's fury and the wild beating of Michael's heart. He stared at Maria Santos across the small table, her words hanging in the candlelit air like incense. "We're the ones who've been waiting for you." Every rational fiber of his being screamed at him to stand up, thank them for their hospitality, and walk back into the storm. Return to his car, drive through the night to Albuquerque, and pretend this surreal encounter had been nothing more than a grief-induced hallucination. His life waited for him there, messy and broken as it was, but familiar, predictable, safe. "Ready to learn what?" he whispered, though part of him dreaded the answer. Maria's eyes reflected the candlelight like dark water. "Why Sarah's death brought you to us. Why your crisis of faith has been preparing you for something greater than you've imagined." Michael's chair scraped against the floor as he pushed back from the table. "I think I should go." "Should you?" Samuel asked, his small voice cutting through Michael's rising panic. "Or are you just scared?" The boy's directness was unsettling. Children weren't supposed to see through adult facades with such clarity, weren't supposed to ask questions that stripped away decades of careful self-protection. Michael had spent months avoiding his own reflection in mirrors, unable to face the hollow-eyed stranger who stared back. Now, a 7-year-old was holding up a mirror he couldn't turn away from. I'm not, Michael began, then stopped. The lie wouldn't form. In this kitchen where 3 generations had prayed, where honesty seemed to seep from the very walls, pretense felt impossible. Yes, I'm terrified. Of what? Maria asked gently. Michael's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. Where could he begin? He was terrified of disappointing his congregation, of confirming Bishop Martinez's growing suspicions about his fitness for ministry. He was terrified of the questions that would follow if he stayed here much longer, questions he couldn't answer without sounding insane. But beneath those surface fears lay something deeper, more primal. He was terrified of hope itself. For 6 months he'd wrapped himself in guilt and despair like a hair shirt, punishing himself for Sarah's death by refusing comfort, rejecting grace, choosing numbness over the possibility of healing. It was a form of penance that felt righteous, even as it destroyed him. I'm afraid of getting it wrong again, he said finally, of making another choice that gets someone hurt. If I hadn't called Sarah, if I'd just endured my doubts in silence like priests are supposed to do, she would still be dead, Maria said quietly. Just not in the way you imagine. Michael's head snapped up. What do you mean? Maria rose from her chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the storm-lashed village. You think faith means certainty, Father. You think a good priest never questions, never doubts, never struggles with the darkness that touches every human soul. But that's not faith. That's fear wearing a holy mask. My bishop would disagree. Your bishop is a man, as fallible as any other, but the God you serve. Maria turned back to face him, and for a moment her features seemed to shift in the candlelight, becoming something both ancient and timeless. That God knows the value of a broken heart that still seeks the light. Samuel had been watching this exchange with the intensity of someone following a conversation in a language he was still learning. Now he slipped from his stool and approached Michael again, his small hand finding the priest's shoulder. Mama died too, the boy said matter-of-factly. But she says dying isn't the same as leaving. She says some people get stuck between worlds, waiting to help the ones who are still learning how to live. The kitchen seemed to tilt around Michael. He looked at Samuel's serious face, then at Maria, who stood silhouetted against the storm-dark window, and felt reality shifting beneath him like sand. The rational part of his mind catalogued impossibilities. The boy's 2 knowing eyes, Maria's ageless face, the way their words seemed to reach directly into his soul without passing through his ears. This isn't happening, he murmured. I'm having a breakdown. The stress, the guilt, I've finally snapped. Have you? Maria asked, returning to the table. Or have you finally opened your eyes to something that's always been there, waiting for you to be broken enough to see it? Michael thought of his empty rectory, of morning masses offered to congregation members who still believed their priest had answers. He thought of the theological certainties that had once anchored his life, now revealed as tissue paper in a hurricane. He thought of Sarah's voice on the phone that final morning, filled with love and concern for her struggling brother. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside this small kitchen, surrounded by the impossible presence of people who claimed to have been waiting for him, Michael felt himself standing at the edge of an abyss. Behind him lay everything familiar and safe. Ahead lay mystery, terror, and the faint possibility of something his grief-hollowed heart barely dared name: redemption. I don't know how to do this, he whispered. Maria smiled. None of us do, Father. That's what makes it faith. Michael sat in the candle-flickering silence, Maria's words echoing in his mind, that's what makes it faith. His hands still trembled as he lifted the coffee cup to his lips one more time, though the liquid had grown cold. The bitter taste seemed appropriate. Everything about this moment carried the flavor of endings and beginnings, of choices that would remake the landscape of his soul. What do you need me to do? The question escaped before he could stop it, surprising him with its certainty. Somewhere between Samuel's matter-of-fact revelation about his mother's death and Maria's gentle insistence that brokenness was not disqualification but preparation, Michael had crossed an invisible line. The priest who had driven up this mountain hours ago, the man who measured faith in doctrine and duties, was dissolving like salt in rain. Maria's smile deepened, transforming her face into something luminous. First, you need to understand what you've already done by staying, by choosing not to run when your rational mind screamed at you to flee. I haven't chosen anything, Michael protested. I'm just trapped by the storm. Samuel giggled from his perch by the stove, the sound bright as silver bells. The storm's been over for 10 minutes, Father Mike. Michael's head whipped toward the window. The boy was right. The glass no longer rattled with wind, no lightning illuminated the night sky. When had the silence fallen? How had he not noticed the sudden absence of rain drumming against the roof? Your car will start, Maria said gently. The roads are passable. You could be back in Albuquerque by sunrise, in time for your morning obligations. Mrs. Rodriguez would never know you were gone. The mention of his housekeeper's name should have comforted him. A tether to the real world, to schedules and expectations and the safe prison of his former life. Instead, it felt like a word spoken in a foreign language, belonging to someone he used to be. Michael stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. Through the kitchen window, he could see stars emerging between breaking clouds, their light reflecting off puddles in the village streets. The ancient wooden cross stood silhouetted against the clearing sky, exactly where he'd left his grief and found these impossible people who spoke of faith as if it were a living thing rather than a theological concept. If I stay, he said carefully, if I accept that this is real, whatever this is, there's no going back, is there? Maria moved to stand beside him at the window, her presence radiating warmth that had nothing to do with the wood-burning stove. There's always a way back, Father. But the man who returns won't be the same one who leaves. You can't unknow what you're about to know. And what am I about to know? That the veil between worlds is thinner than your theology taught you, that love transcends death in ways more literal and mysterious than your training prepared you for, that your sister's death was not punishment for your doubts, but preparation for understanding how grace works through brokenness. Michael's breath caught. Sarah? What does Sarah have to do with everything? Samuel had approached them at the window, his small hand slipping into Michael's larger one. The boy's touch carried an electric warmth that seemed to flow directly into the priest's chest, filling the hollow spaces where faith used to live. She's been trying to reach you, but you've been too scared to listen, too guilty to believe you deserve forgiveness. The kitchen around them seemed to pulse with invisible energy, as if the very air were charged with presence and possibility. Michael felt the last moorings of his old life snapping one by one, his carefully maintained schedule, his reputation for reliability, his bishop's expectations, his congregation's needs. For months, these had felt like chains dragging him toward a drowning he couldn't escape. Now they felt like shed skin, necessary to discard before new growth could begin. The people at my parish, he said weakly, they depend on me. Do they? Maria asked. Or have you been so lost in your own darkness that you've forgotten how to be the light they actually need? Michael closed his eyes, and for the first time in months he could see his parishioners clearly, not as burdens or obligations, but as fellow travelers carrying their own hidden wounds. Mrs. Patterson, whose husband's drinking masked his terror of mortality, the Morales family celebrating their daughter's quinceañera while secretly grieving the grandmother who wouldn't live to see her graduate, the teenagers in his youth group, hungry for authentic faith in a world that offered them only empty certainties. When he opened his eyes again, Samuel was watching him with those ancient eyes that seemed to hold starlight, and Maria stood waiting with the patience of someone who had waited 30 years for this moment. All right, Michael whispered, the words feeling like both surrender and victory. Show me. The candles flickered as if touched by an invisible wind, and somewhere in the distance, though whether from memory or reality he could no longer tell, Sarah's laughter echoed through the kitchen like a promise. The laughter faded, leaving Michael suspended in a silence that felt pregnant with possibility. He stood between Maria and Samuel at the window, their warmth radiating through him like benediction, watching the last clouds scatter across a star-drunk sky. The village of San Miguel lay peaceful below them, its adobe houses silvered by moonlight, but Michael sensed movement in that stillness, shadows that weren't quite shadows, whispers that weren't quite wind. "The first rule," Maria said softly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had navigated these mysteries for decades, "is that you cannot force this gift. You cannot demand proof or catalogue miracles like theological footnotes. Faith of this kind requires surrender, not conquest." As if summoned by her words, a figure materialized at the edge of Michael's vision. Translucent at first, then gaining substance like morning mist condensing into dew, an elderly man in overalls walked slowly down the village's main street, his gait careful and deliberate. Michael blinked hard, certain the apparition would vanish, but the figure remained, pausing beneath a street lamp to tip his hat toward their window. "That's Mr. Valdez," Samuel said matter-of-factly. "He built most of the houses here. Died 5 years ago, but he still checks on his work. Old habits." Michael's hands pressed against the glass, his breath fogging the surface. "I'm seeing a dead man walking down the street." "Are you?" Maria asked. "Or are you finally seeing what was always there, waiting for eyes willing to look beyond the veil?" The rational priest within him catalogued explanations: hallucination, stress-induced psychosis, elaborate hoax. But even as his mind reached for these lifelines, his heart recognized truth in the impossible scene unfolding before him. Mr. Valdez paused at a house where yellow light spilled from windows, his ghostly form peering through glass at a family gathering around a dinner table. For just a moment, Michael glimpsed the love in that gaze, protective, endless, transcendent of death itself. "There are others," Samuel whispered. And suddenly Michael could see them everywhere. A woman in a white dress tending a garden that bloomed impossibly in autumn. A young soldier sitting on a church step, his uniform bearing insignia from wars decades past. Children playing in a plaza that had been empty moments before, their laughter carrying on wind that touched only him. "San Miguel is a thin place," Maria explained, her hand finding his shoulder. "Built on ground where the living and dead have always walked together. That's why we were brought here, Samuel and I. That's why you were led to the cross tonight, where the boundaries blur and grace breaks through." Michael's legs gave out, and he found himself sitting heavily in the wooden chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was witnessing. "Why can I see them? What makes me special?" "Nothing makes you special," Samuel said, but there was no unkindness in his words. Lots of people could see if they wanted to. But wanting to see and being ready to see are different things. You had to be broken open first. You had to lose everything you thought you knew about how God works. A new presence entered Michael's peripheral vision, and his heart stopped. She stood at the kitchen's threshold, not quite in the room, not quite outside it, with auburn hair that caught candlelight and green eyes that held oceans of compassion. Sarah, his sister, real and impossible and heartbreakingly familiar. "Hello, Mickey," she said, using the childhood nickname that no one else had ever been allowed to speak. Her voice carried the warmth of summer afternoons and Christmas mornings and every moment of unconditional love he'd ever known. Michael shot to his feet, the chair clattering behind him. "Sarah, God, Sarah, I'm so sorry. I killed you. I called you into that storm." "Stop!" Her word carried such gentle authority that his anguished apology died in his throat. "You didn't kill anyone, little brother. You loved someone. There's a difference, though grief has blinded you to it." She stepped fully into the kitchen, and Michael saw that she cast no shadow in the candlelight, left no footprints on the worn wooden floor. Yet her presence filled the space with such life that the very air seemed to shimmer. "I came because I wanted to," Sarah continued. "Not because you needed me to, but because love doesn't end at the grave. Because my little brother was drowning in guilt, and I've never been able to stand by when someone I love is hurting." Maria and Samuel had retreated to give them space, becoming quiet witnesses to a reunion that defied every law of nature and theology Michael had ever learned. Yet standing here in this kitchen where 3 generations had prayed, where the impossible was simply Tuesday evening's truth, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "The second rule," Sarah said, reaching toward him with fingers that looked solid but felt like starlight against his cheek, "is that love always finds a way." Michael's hand rose instinctively to cover Sarah's ghostly touch, his fingers passing through hers like moonbeams through water, yet somehow still feeling the warmth of her love. The sensation sent tremors through his entire body, not fear, but recognition so profound it threatened to shatter what remained of his carefully constructed understanding of reality. "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice breaking like a teenage boy's. "If you're here, if you can touch me, speak to me. Why didn't you come before? I've been dying without you, Sarah. 6 months of hell and you were—" "Waiting," she finished gently. "Waiting for you to break open enough to receive what I needed to give you. Mickey, you've spent your entire life trying to be perfect for God, for the church, for everyone except yourself. Your guilt was a wall I couldn't penetrate, not because I wasn't strong enough, but because you weren't ready to forgive yourself enough to let me through." Behind them, Maria moved quietly about the kitchen, lighting additional candles with the reverence of someone preparing an altar. Samuel sat cross-legged on the floor, his ancient eyes watching the siblings with the satisfaction of a child who had successfully orchestrated a long-planned surprise. The room filled with golden light that seemed to emanate as much from Sarah's presence as from the flickering flames. "The night you called me," Sarah continued, settling into the chair Michael had abandoned, her form solidifying with each word, "I was already dying, Mickey. The cancer had spread further than I'd told you. I had maybe weeks left, not months. When you reached out in your crisis of faith, needing your big sister, it was a gift, not a burden." Michael's knees buckled, and he found himself kneeling on the worn wooden floor, eye level with Sarah's luminous face. "You never said—" "The doctors told me you were responding to treatment. Because you needed hope, not another weight on your shoulders. But Mickey, listen to me." Sarah leaned forward, her ethereal hands framing his face. "That storm, the accident, it was mercy disguised as tragedy. Instead of wasting away in a hospital bed, pumped full of chemicals that couldn't save me, I died racing toward the person I loved most in this world. I died with purpose, with love in my heart, trying to help heal the rift between my baby brother and his God." The words hit Michael like physical blows, each one dismantling another brick in the fortress of guilt he'd built around his heart. For months he'd replayed that phone conversation, torturing himself with different words he could have spoken, different choices he could have made. Now Sarah was revealing that his perceived failure had actually been her salvation. "The third rule," Maria said softly from across the kitchen, "is that sometimes what looks like ending is actually beginning. Death is not defeat, it's transformation." Michael felt something fundamental shifting inside his chest, like tectonic plates realigning after an earthquake. The hollow space where his faith used to live began to fill with something new, not the rigid certainties he'd carried into priesthood, but a living, breathing trust in mysteries beyond his comprehension. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice steadier than it had been in months. "Why are you all here? What do you need from me?" Sarah's smile held echoes of every Christmas morning, every scraped knee she'd bandaged, every nightmare she'd chased away with stories and songs. "We need you to carry a message back to the world of the living. Not just about us, about the love that survives death, the forgiveness that transcends flesh, the hope that lives in the space between heartbeats." Samuel rose from his place on the floor, approaching Michael with something glowing cupped in his small hands. As he drew closer, Michael could see it was a smooth stone, river-worn and warm, that pulsed with the same golden light that filled the kitchen. "This is from the old chapel," the boy explained, "the one that stood here before the village was built. Mama says it holds the prayers of everyone who ever knelt where we're kneeling now, going back hundreds of years." but it needs to travel to where the living can touch it, can remember that thin places exist everywhere if you know how to look. Michael accepted the stone, gasping as power flowed through his palms and up his arms. Images flashed behind his eyes. Generations of believers kneeling in candlelit darkness, pouring their hearts out to a God who heard every whispered word. He saw his own future congregation, hungry for the authentic hope he could now offer, freed from the prison of his own despair. "The fourth rule," Sarah said, rising from her chair as dawn light began to creep through the kitchen window, "is that some gifts can only be given by the broken to the breaking. You've been prepared for this, Mickey. Your crisis of faith wasn't failure, it was education." Outside, the village began to stir with morning sounds. Roosters crowing, doors opening, the everyday symphony of the living world. But inside the kitchen, suspended between night and day, Michael finally understood why his journey had led him to this impossible place, to these messengers who wore death like borrowed clothes. He was being prepared for return. The stone pulsed in Michael's hands like a living heart, its warmth spreading through his body until he felt as if he were glowing from within. But with that power came a terrible realization. Accepting this gift meant accepting everything it represented. The weight of supernatural truth, the responsibility of carrying impossible hope back to a skeptical world, the certainty that his life as he'd known it was ending this very moment. "I can't," he whispered, the words torn from his throat like a physical wound. "You don't understand what you're asking. I'm a parish priest in suburban Albuquerque. I give communion to accountants and soccer moms. I counsel teenagers about dating and help elderly parishioners plan their funerals. If I walk into St. Augustine's tomorrow morning claiming I've spoken with the dead, they'll have me committed." Sarah's form began to shimmer as dawn light grew stronger, her edges softening like watercolors bleeding into paper. "And if you walk in empty-handed, carrying the same hollow words you've been offering for months? What happens to Mrs. Patterson when her husband finally drinks himself to death? What happens to the Morales family when Grandmother Rosa passes next month? What happens to all the souls crying out for authentic hope when their shepherd has none to give?" The stone grew heavier in his hands, or perhaps Michael's arms were weakening under the magnitude of what was being asked of him. Every fiber of his priestly training screamed against this madness. Seminary had prepared him for doubt, for theological questions, for the gentle mysteries of faith explored through scripture and tradition. It had not prepared him for dead children offering him stones that held centuries of prayer, for his sister's ghost demanding he become a bridge between worlds. "They'll strip my collar," he said, panic rising in his voice. "The bishop will declare me mentally unfit. Everything I've worked for, everything I've built, everything you've hidden behind," Samuel corrected, his young voice cutting through Michael's protests with surgical precision. "When did you last feel God in your sanctuary, Father Mike? When did you last speak a homily that came from faith instead of habit?" The question hit like a physical blow because Michael couldn't remember. Months, maybe years of going through the motions, of delivering carefully crafted sermons that said nothing, of performing sacraments that felt as empty as theatrical props. He'd become exactly what he'd feared most when he'd entered seminary 25 years ago, a professional religious administering faith he no longer possessed. Maria moved to the window where the last stars were fading into pale sky. "The choice has to be yours, Father. We cannot force this burden on unwilling shoulders, but understand what you're truly choosing between." As she spoke, the kitchen around them began to shift. The warm golden light that had filled the space started to fade, revealing cracks in the adobe walls that hadn't been visible before. The wooden table showed its true age, centuries of wear, deep gouges from countless meals, burns from candles that had illuminated prayers spoken in languages older than English. Even Maria and Samuel seemed to flicker, their solid forms becoming translucent as the boundary between worlds reasserted itself with the coming dawn. "If you take the stone," Maria continued, "you'll never again have the luxury of empty faith. You'll carry the weight of knowing that love survives death, that miracles walk among us wearing ordinary faces, that every funeral you perform is not an ending but a transformation. You'll have to live as if the veil between worlds is thin as tissue paper, because for you, it will be. And if I refuse? Sarah's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, already fading into memory. Then you return to your safe, manageable doubt. You continue going through the motions until retirement or death, whichever comes first. You bury your gifts under the weight of respectability and spend the rest of your life wondering if tonight was real or just the delusion of a broken mind. Michael looked down at the stone, its glow now barely perceptible in the growing daylight. He could feel the prayers it contained, desperate pleas from conquistadors facing death in foreign lands, whispered hopes from native mothers watching their children sicken with diseases brought by strangers, anguished cries from settlers burying loved ones in unforgiving soil, all of it leading to this moment, this choice, this terrifying invitation to step beyond the boundaries of everything he'd thought he knew about ministry. Outside, a church bell began to toll, not from San Miguel, which had no bell tower, but from some distant parish calling the faithful to morning mass. The sound reached through the kitchen window like a hand extended across an impossible chasm, offering him one last chance to flee back to the comfortable prison of conventional faith. The stone pulsed once more in his palms, and Michael felt the first tears he'd shed since Sarah's funeral sliding down his cheeks. Not tears of grief this time, but of terrified recognition. His real ministry was about to begin. The stone slipped from Michael's trembling fingers. It hit the wooden floor with a sound like thunder, or perhaps that was only the echo in his heart as he watched centuries of prayer shatter into glowing fragments. The kitchen filled with the crystalline music of breaking, each piece of the ancient stone carrying away voices that had waited lifetimes to be heard. "No," Sarah whispered, her form already fading with the dying light. "Mickey, no!" But Michael was stumbling backward, his hands pressed against his temples as if he could physically hold together the breaking pieces of his mind. The weight of it all crashed down on him at once, not just the supernatural impossibility of the night, but the crushing realization of what acceptance would truly cost him. His parish, his reputation, his carefully constructed life, everything he'd built since Sarah's death, every small step back toward functionality, crumbling like the stone at his feet. "I'm sorry," he gasped, backing toward the kitchen door. "I'm not strong enough. I can't, I won't." The fragments of stone flickered once more and went dark. With their light gone, the kitchen revealed its true nature, not the warm, lived-in space where he'd shared miraculous hours, but a ruin. Adobe walls crumbled inward, exposing wooden beams blackened by decades of weather. The table was nothing but splinters and dust. Candle stubs sat in pools of hardened wax that looked years old. Samuel's face crumpled with disappointment that aged him beyond his 7 years. "You were supposed to be the one," Mama said. When the priest came crying to the cross, he would be ready. She said, "Samuel." Maria's voice carried infinite sadness as she moved to comfort her son, both of their forms growing translucent in the growing daylight. "Not everyone can carry what we offer. Not everyone is meant to." But the words felt like condemnation rather than absolution. Michael fled through the doorway, stumbling into morning light that seemed harsh and unforgiving after the golden glow of the kitchen. Behind him, he heard Sarah calling his name, not angry, but heartbroken. The sound of his sister's ghost weeping followed him as he ran through the village square, past the ancient cross where his breakdown had begun. San Miguel in daylight bore no resemblance to the mystical settlement he'd experienced in darkness. Adobe houses stood empty, their windows dark and lifeless. Weeds choked the plaza where ghostly children had played. The whole place felt abandoned, forgotten, a tourist stop that had outlived its purpose, not a thin place where heaven touched earth. His rental car sat where he'd left it, covered in morning dew and autumn leaves. Michael fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the door handle. When the engine turned over, the sound seemed obscenely loud in the village's silence, like a chainsaw ripping through cathedral quiet. As he pulled away, Michael caught a glimpse in his rearview mirror, 3 figures standing beside the cross, growing fainter with each yard of distance. Sarah raised her hand in farewell, or perhaps blessing, before she vanished entirely into memory and regret. The drive back to Albuquerque passed in a blur of self-recrimination. What had he done? What had he walked away from? By the time he reached the city limits, Michael had almost convinced himself it had been a breakdown after all, grief-induced hallucination, stress psychosis, anything except the earth-shattering truth his rational mind couldn't accept. St. Augustine's parish sat like a monument to ordinary faith, its red brick walls and practical steeple offering none of the mystical resonance he'd felt in San Miguel. Michael sat in his car in the empty parking lot, staring at the building where he'd delivered hollow sermons and performed empty rituals for months. This was real, this was manageable, this was safe. His phone buzzed with 17 missed calls from his assistant, Father Rodriguez, and a text message that made his blood freeze. Emergency at hospital. Mrs. Patterson's husband in ICU. She's asking for you. Been calling all night. The words hit him like physical blows. Mrs. Patterson, the widow-to-be whose husband was drinking himself toward death, the woman Sarah had specifically mentioned as needing hope Michael couldn't provide. She'd been waiting for him through the night, crying out for comfort while he'd been offered the very gift that could heal her breaking heart. And he'd run. He'd chosen safety over service, doubt over faith, his own fear over the desperate needs of his flock. Michael buried his face in his hands and wept. Not the cleansing tears of the night before, but the bitter salt of loss that couldn't be undone. Somewhere in the mountains, fragments of an ancient stone lay dark and lifeless on the floor of a ruined kitchen. Somewhere in eternity, his sister waited for a messenger who would never come. He'd been offered ministry beyond imagination, and he'd chosen the familiar prison of manageable despair. All was lost. Michael sat in that hospital parking lot for 3 hours, paralyzed between worlds. Through the emergency room windows, he could see the controlled chaos of morning rounds, nurses checking charts, orderlies wheeling patients down corridors, families clustered in waiting areas with coffee cups and hollow eyes. The familiar territory of bedside ministry, last rites and grief counseling beckoned like a well-worn path. But something had fundamentally shifted during his night in San Miguel. Even as his rational mind screamed that it had been hallucination, his body remembered the weight of that stone, the warmth of Sarah's presence, the ancient power thrumming through the kitchen walls. He could still taste the supernatural on his tongue like copper pennies, could still feel the echo of centuries-old prayers vibrating in his bones. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the hospital entrance at 9:15, moving like a woman underwater. Michael watched her stumble toward her car, saw her collapse against the driver's side door, shoulders shaking with exhausted grief. Her husband had died while her parish priest was running from miracles, fleeing from the very hope that could have sustained her through this darkness. The sight of her breaking hit Michael like a physical blow, but not the way he expected. Instead of the familiar guilt that had paralyzed him for months, something else rose in his chest, a burning recognition that felt like divine anger. Not at God, not at fate, but at himself, at his cowardice, at his willingness to let others drown in despair while he protected his own comfortable doubt. Sarah's words echoed with sudden, terrible clarity. Some gifts can only be given by the broken to the breaking. Michael's breath caught as the pieces clicked into place with crystalline precision. He hadn't been offered the stone as a burden. He'd been offered it as completion. All those months of crisis, of questioning, of feeling empty and lost, it hadn't been spiritual failure. It had been preparation. He'd needed to be broken open, needed to know the taste of authentic despair, so he could offer authentic hope to others walking the same dark valley. Mrs. Patterson wasn't the only one. In the past year alone, how many parishioners had sat across from him seeking comfort he couldn't provide? The Gonzalez family when their teenage daughter overdosed. Old Mr. Chen facing terminal cancer diagnosis. The young mother whose premature baby died in NICU. He'd offered them textbook consolations, scripture verses, theological platitudes, all true, all correct, all utterly insufficient for souls crying out in real anguish. But now he understood why his ministry had felt so hollow. He'd been trying to give hope he didn't possess, to offer comfort from a well that had run dry. The broken stone wasn't loss, it was revelation. He couldn't carry the supernatural gift because he wasn't supposed to. The gift wasn't the stone itself. The gift was remembering that miracles existed at all. Michael's hands moved to his cell phone without conscious decision, fingers finding Mrs. Patterson's number with muscle memory. When she answered on the fourth ring, her voice was thick with tears and exhaustion. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Father Michael. I just saw you leaving the hospital. I'm so sorry I wasn't there." "He's gone." The words came out flat, hollow. "Tom's gone. I waited for you to come, to give him last rites, but I know, I failed you, and I'm sorrier than I can say. But Mrs. Patterson, listen to me." Michael closed his eyes, feeling Sarah's presence like a whisper against his heart. "Your husband isn't lost. Love like yours doesn't just disappear because a heart stops beating. The man who chose you, who built a life with you, who fought his demons as long as he could, that man still exists, just not in the way we can see. Father, I don't understand." "Neither do I completely. But last night I learned something I'd forgotten. That death isn't defeat, it's transformation. The love between you and Tom, it's still real, still present, still continuing in ways that don't fit our understanding, but are true nonetheless." He heard her sharp intake of breath, felt something shift in the quality of her silence. This wasn't theological theory anymore. These words carried the weight of impossible experience, of actually touching the veil between worlds and finding it gossamer thin. "Where were you?" she whispered. "Last night, when I needed you, where were you?" Michael opened his eyes, watching clouds race across the autumn sky, feeling his sister's forgiveness settling around his shoulders like a benediction. "I was being taught how to minister to you, how to offer you hope that's real instead of hope that's just pretty words." The revelation hit him with stunning force. He didn't need to carry fragments of supernatural stone back to his congregation. He needed to carry himself back, transformed by having touched the impossible, broken open enough to pour real comfort into other broken places. His faith hadn't returned unchanged, it had returned resurrected. 20 minutes later, Mrs. Patterson sat across from Michael in the hospital chapel, her tear-streaked face reflecting the kaleidoscope of colors streaming through stained glass windows. Between them lay not the comfortable distance of formal pastoral care, but the intimate proximity of shared brokenness. Two people who had stared into the abyss and found unexpected light in its depths. "I don't know how you knew," she whispered, clutching a tissue that had dissolved into shreds between her fingers. "Those words you said about Tom, about love continuing, it's exactly what I needed to hear. Not because it was pretty, but because it felt true. Like you'd seen it somehow." Michael studied her face, seeing the subtle shift that had occurred during their conversation. The desperate edge of her grief had softened into something still painful, but no longer hopeless. Her shoulders had straightened. The terrible hollowness behind her eyes had been replaced by something fragile but growing, the first green shoots of healing pushing through scorched earth. "Mrs. Patterson, can I ask you something?" Michael leaned forward, his voice carrying the authority of recent revelation. "In the past hour, talking together, have you felt Tom's presence at all, even just for a moment?" She nodded immediately, without the hesitation of someone checking whether her answer was theologically correct. "Yes. When you spoke about transformation instead of ending, I felt him, like he was relieved that someone finally understood." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but these carried lightness instead of despair. "Father, what's happened to you? You sound different. You sound like someone who actually believes what he's saying." The question pierced straight to the heart of his transformation. 3 days ago, Michael would have deflected with humble platitudes about faith being a journey. Now, sitting in this chapel where he'd performed countless rituals while spiritually sleepwalking, he understood that ministry required absolute honesty, especially about mystery. "I was lost," he said simply. "For months I'd been giving people comfort I didn't feel, hope I didn't possess. Last night I was given a gift, not the gift I thought I wanted, but the one I actually needed. I learned that being broken isn't disqualification for ministry, it's preparation. Mrs. Patterson reached across the space between them and touched his hand, a gesture that would have felt inappropriate yesterday, but now felt like confirmation. Whatever happened to you, Father, it's real. I can feel it. After 43 years of marriage, I know the difference between pretty words and truth that can hold weight. As she spoke, Michael felt pieces of a new understanding crystallizing in his mind. The stone had been a test, not a prize. The real gift wasn't supernatural power, it was the willingness to speak from the place where he'd been wounded and healed. Every broken parishioner who would sit across from him in the coming months would need to see in his eyes that he'd walked through their particular darkness and found his way back to light. "I need to ask something of you," he said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "Will you help me? There are others in our parish walking the same road you're on, people I haven't been able to reach because I was trying to help them from the outside. But you've made the journey. You know the landscape." Her eyes widened with something that looked like awakening purpose. "You want me to minister to other widows? I want you to minister to anyone who needs to know that love survives death, that grief can be survived, that the worst endings aren't really endings at all." Michael felt Sarah's presence so strongly it was almost visible, not as supernatural manifestation, but as the natural result of speaking truth that honored her memory. "I can offer theology. You can offer testimony." Mrs. Patterson straightened in her chair, and Michael watched grief transform into mission before his eyes. This was how resurrection worked. Not flashy displays of power, but the quiet miracle of turning victims into healers, survivors into guides. "The Morales family," she said suddenly. "You mentioned their grandmother is dying. I could sit with them, help them prepare for—" She paused, testing new vocabulary. "For her transformation." "Yes." The word carried the weight of answered prayer, of puzzle pieces clicking into perfect alignment. And the young mother who lost her baby last month, and Mr. Chen facing his cancer diagnosis. "We'll build a ministry around authentic hope instead of theoretical comfort." Michael stood, feeling strength flowing back into bones that had carried nothing but weariness for months. The chapel around them seemed to brighten, as if the stained glass windows had suddenly decided to transmit more light. This was what resurrection looked like in practice, not the dramatic return from death, but the patient work of building life on foundations that death couldn't shake. He'd lost the stone, but found something infinitely more valuable, a congregation ready to be transformed by the same truth that had healed him. Love did survive death. Brokenness could become strength, and ministry born from authentic suffering could heal wounds that pristine theology never touched. The real miracle wasn't supernatural visitation. It was ordinary people choosing to become extraordinary messengers of hope. Over the following weeks, Michael threw himself into the work with an urgency that bordered on desperation. What had begun as inspiration in the hospital chapel crystallized into something approaching obsession, a relentless drive to transform his parish before doubt could creep back in, before the rational world could explain away what he'd experienced in San Miguel. Mrs. Patterson proved to be everything he'd hoped, and more. She moved through the grieving families of St. Augustine's like a gentle force of nature, speaking the language of loss with fluency earned through suffering. Under her guidance, the Morales family faced their grandmother's final days with grace instead of denial. The young mother who'd lost her premature son began attending grief support meetings instead of hiding in her house. Mr. Chen spoke openly about his cancer for the first time, finding strength in Mrs. Patterson's unwavering certainty that love transcended physical endings. But with each small victory, Michael felt the weight of what he'd left unfinished pressing heavier on his shoulders. Sarah's mission, the message that had waited 30 years for delivery, remained incomplete. Somewhere in the mountains, fragments of an ancient stone lay dark and powerless because he'd chosen safety over faith when it mattered most. The consequences of that choice began manifesting in ways he couldn't ignore. His sleep grew restless, filled with dreams of Samuel's disappointed face and Maria's fading form. During Mass, he'd find himself scanning the congregation for translucent figures that never appeared. The supernatural sensitivity that had awakened in San Miguel seemed to be atrophying from disuse, like a muscle that grew weak without exercise. 3 weeks after his return, the crisis came to a head. Father Rodriguez approached him after evening prayer, his usually cheerful demeanor clouded with concern. "Michael, I need to ask, are you all right? Really all right?" The younger priest settled into the pew beside him, choosing his words carefully. "The changes in your ministry have been remarkable. Mrs. Patterson's work, the new grief support programs, it's exactly what this parish needed. But you seem haunted, like someone carrying a burden too heavy for one person." Michael stared at the crucifix hanging above the altar, remembering how the wooden cross in San Miguel had seemed alive with ancient power. Here, in his familiar church, everything felt muted, ordinary, safely contained within the boundaries of acceptable faith. "What would you do," he asked slowly, "if you'd been offered something impossible? Something that could help people beyond anything we've accomplished so far, but accepting it would cost you everything you've built?" Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of theological training balanced against pastoral experience. "I'd ask myself whether what I'd built was worth preserving if it meant abandoning what I was called to do." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. For weeks, he'd been congratulating himself on the parish's transformation, on the lives being touched through Mrs. Patterson's ministry. But underneath the satisfaction lurked a growing certainty that he was settling for partial healing when complete restoration had been offered and refused. "There's something I haven't told you about my retreat," Michael began, then stopped. How could he explain supernatural visitation to a man trained in rational theology? How could he describe the weight of carrying messages from the dead without sounding like he'd lost his mind? But as he looked at Rodriguez, really looked at him, Michael saw something he'd missed before. This wasn't a man who'd built his faith on certainty and logic alone. There was something in his eyes, a depth of experience that suggested he'd wrestled with mystery and come away changed. "I met my sister," Michael said simply. "My dead sister. She and others like her have been waiting for someone willing to carry their message of hope to the living world. I was chosen, given a gift that could transform how we understand death and resurrection. And I ran. I chose this," he gestured around the chapel, "over what I was actually called to do." Rodriguez nodded slowly, as if supernatural confession was something he heard every Tuesday evening. "And now you're trying to decide whether to go back." "Going back would mean giving up this parish, my position, probably my standing in the church entirely. Who would believe me? Who would accept ministry from someone claiming direct contact with the dead?" Michael's voice cracked with the weight of accumulated fear. "But staying means abandoning people who are counting on me to finish what I started." Michael Rodriguez turned to face him fully, his expression grave but not shocked. "What makes you think transformation has to mean destruction? What if the choice isn't between your old life and your calling, but between hiding your calling and integrating it?" The suggestion hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Michael felt something shift in his chest, not the crushing weight of impossible choice, but the first stirring of a third option he'd been too frightened to consider. The road back to San Miguel was becoming less a question of whether and more a question of how. Michael drove through the night, his hands steady on the wheel despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. In the passenger seat sat a leather satchel containing something that would have seemed impossible a year ago, official documentation from the Archbishop's office, authorizing him to conduct what they'd carefully termed extended spiritual counseling in remote communities. Rodriguez's connections and diplomatic skills had worked miracles of their own. The conversation with Archbishop Morrison had been surreal in its unexpected openness. When Michael had finally confessed the full truth, the visitations, the stone, the messages waiting to be delivered, he'd braced for dismissal, possibly excommunication. Instead, Morrison had leaned back in his chair and spoken words that still echoed in Michael's memory. "Father Hartley, the Church has always acknowledged mysteries beyond our understanding. What matters isn't whether I believe your experience, it's whether God is calling you to act on it. Now, as the familiar peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains emerged from pre-dawn darkness, Michael felt the weight of that calling settling around him like armor. This wasn't the desperate flight of 3 weeks ago when he'd run from responsibility. This was a deliberate return, armed with everything he'd learned about ministry, about brokenness, about the delicate work of carrying hope between worlds. The wooden cross appeared as the first rays of sunlight touched the valley, exactly as he remembered it, ancient, weathered, somehow alive with patient expectation. Michael parked and walked slowly toward the base, his heart hammering against his ribs. The fragments of the stone lay scattered in the tall grass, dull and lifeless in the morning light. But as his shadow fell across them, something stirred in the air, a subtle shift that made his breath catch. "You came back." Samuel's voice was soft, wondering, carrying none of the disappointment Michael had feared. The boy materialized gradually, as if stepping through layers of reality. "Mama said you would. She said sometimes people need time to grow strong enough for their calling." Michael knelt among the stone fragments, feeling the supernatural sensitivity awakening in his chest like a flame carefully tended back to life. The pieces seemed to pulse with inner light as his fingers hovered above them. But this time, he understood something crucial. The power wasn't in the stone itself, it was in his willingness to serve as a bridge between desperate need and impossible hope. "I understand now," he whispered, and the words carried the weight of authentic transformation. "I thought I had to choose between my old life and this calling, but they're not separate things. They're part of the same ministry." As his hands closed around the largest fragment, light blazed between his fingers, not the overwhelming torrent that had frightened him before, but something warm, controlled, purposeful. The other pieces rose from the grass without him touching them, drawn by some magnetic force until they hung suspended in the air around him, each one pulsing with the rhythm of his heartbeat. Maria appeared at the edge of his vision, her form more solid than he'd ever seen it. Behind her, other figures began to emerge from the morning mist, dozens of them, men and women of all ages, all wearing expressions of profound relief. These were the souls who'd been waiting, carrying messages of love and forgiveness that needed to reach the living world. "We've been preparing for this moment," Maria said, her voice carrying across dimensions with crystalline clarity. "Each soul you see has someone among the living who needs to know they rear at peace, who needs to understand that death isn't defeat. You're not meant to carry supernatural power, Michael. You're meant to carry supernatural love." The stone fragments swirled around him faster now, their light growing brighter. But instead of overwhelming him, the energy felt like completion, pieces of himself that had been scattered by grief and doubt finally clicking back into place. He thought of Mrs. Patterson's transformation, of the grieving families he'd already helped, of the countless others who would need this same message in the years to come. This was why his faith had been broken down so completely. This was why he'd needed to walk through the valley of doubt and despair. Only someone who'd lost everything could carry authentic hope to those facing their own losses. Only someone who'd been resurrected from spiritual death could guide others through the same transformation. The stone settled into his palm, whole and warm, humming with contained power. But more importantly, his heart settled into certainty about his path forward. He would return to St. Augustine's, to his parish and his congregation, but he would also travel wherever he was needed, carrying messages between worlds, helping the living understand that love transcends every boundary, even death itself. The final test wasn't about choosing between two different callings. It was about having the courage to embrace a calling so large it required every broken piece of himself to fulfill. As the figures around him began to fade with the rising sun, Michael knew his real ministry was just beginning. As the figures around him began to fade with the rising sun, Michael felt the stone's warmth pulse against his palm and suddenly realized something was wrong. The warmth was growing cold, the light dimming despite the brightening dawn. Maria's form, which had seemed so solid moments before, flickered like a candle in wind. "What's happening?" he called out, panic threading through his voice. Maria's eyes went wide with an ancient fear. "He's coming. The one who's been holding us here, preventing our messages from reaching the living world. We hoped, that with the stone whole again, his power would be broken, but—" The temperature plummeted. Michael's breath came out in white puffs as frost began forming on the wooden cross, spreading like a disease across its weathered surface. The gathered souls, moments before radiating peace and hope, pressed closer together, their forms growing translucent with terror. Father Hartley. The voice that spoke his name was neither warm nor cold, but something far worse, utterly empty, devoid of any human emotion. How touching. Another broken priest thinking he can play savior. Michael spun toward the voice and felt his blood freeze. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A void in the shape of a man, wearing what might once have been clerical robes. Where his face should have been was nothing but shadow, yet Michael felt the weight of malevolent attention like ice water in his veins. "Father Matthias Kane," Maria whispered, her voice breaking. "He was the priest here before we died. He bound us to this place, fed on our suffering. For 30 years, he's grown stronger, while we've grown weaker." The shadow priest laughed, and the sound made the wooden cross crack down its center. "Suffering is such beautiful sustenance. These souls, trapped between life and death, generate such exquisite despair. And you, Michael Hartley, you've brought me the greatest gift of all. A priest's faith, newly mended, ready to be shattered completely." Terror threatened to overwhelm Michael, but something deeper rose to meet it. A righteous fury that blazed through his chest like cleansing fire. This thing had kept Sarah and the others bound here for decades, feeding on their hope like a parasite. It had prevented countless messages of love from reaching the living world, condemning families to grief without comfort, to loss without meaning. "You have no power here," Michael said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. The stone in his hand grew warm again, responding to his conviction. Kane's laughter grew louder, more terrible. "No power? Child, I've had 30 years to perfect my craft. Watch." He gestured, and agony exploded through Michael's skull. Every doubt he'd ever carried, every moment of despair since Sarah's death, amplified 100-fold. He saw himself causing the accident again and again, felt the weight of every funeral he'd conducted while spiritually empty, experienced the crushing loneliness of a man whose faith had died before his body. But as the assault reached its peak, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Patterson's transformed face appeared in his mind, radiant with newfound hope. The Morales family gathered around their grandmother's bedside. Speaking of transformation instead of ending, all the lives touched through his ministry, not the supernatural calling, but the simple, everyday work of carrying hope to broken hearts. "You're wrong," Michael gasped, forcing himself to stand straighter. "You think suffering is the end of the story, but it's not. It's the beginning of resurrection." The stone blazed in his palm, and suddenly he could see Kane clearly. Not a figure of supernatural terror, but a hollow shell of a man who'd chosen despair over hope, who'd turned his back on the very resurrection he'd been ordained to proclaim. The shadow robes were just that, shadows given form by fear and sustained by the hopelessness of others. "The only power you have," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "is what we give you. And I choose not to give you mine." Kane's form flickered, wavered. Around the clearing, the trapped souls began to shine brighter, their forms solidifying as Michael's faith pushed back against 30 years of accumulated darkness. "You think your little stone makes you strong enough?" Kane snarled, his voice losing its terrible certainty. "You think your suburban ministry prepared you for this?" Michael smiled, and the expression carried the weight of authentic joy discovered in the midst of genuine suffering. "I don't think my ministry prepared me for this. I know my brokenness prepared me for this. Every doubt, every failure, every moment of despair, it all led here, to this moment, to standing against someone who's forgotten what resurrection actually means. The final confrontation wasn't between supernatural forces. It was between two visions of what lay beyond suffering, one that saw only ending and one that dared to believe in beginning. The stone's fire blazed higher, and Michael understood with crystalline clarity what victory would cost. To truly break Cain's hold on the souls, to free them not just temporarily but permanently, the stone itself would have to be sacrificed. Its power, accumulated over centuries, would need to be released all at once in a final conflagration that would shatter the bonds of despair forever. But the stone was his connection to the supernatural realm. Without it, he would return to being an ordinary priest, unable to see between worlds, unable to carry messages from the dead. The calling that had transformed his understanding of ministry, the gift that could comfort countless grieving families, would be lost. Michael. Maria's voice was gentle but urgent. You see what must be done. He nodded, his throat tight with the magnitude of the choice. Around him, the trapped souls pressed closer, not just Sarah and Samuel and Maria, but dozens of others, their faces etched with 30 years of accumulated longing, men and women who'd died with words of love unspoken, children who'd passed before their parents knew they were safe, elderly souls who'd crossed over carrying messages of forgiveness their families desperately needed to hear. Cain seemed to sense the shift in the spiritual atmosphere. His shadow form grew more solid, more menacing. You wouldn't dare. That stone is your only real power, priest. Without it, you're just another broken man with a failing faith. Maybe, Michael said quietly, feeling the stone's weight in his palm, not just its physical mass, but the weight of every soul depending on him. But maybe being broken is exactly what's needed here. He thought of Mrs. Patterson, transformed by a message from her deceased husband that had nothing to do with supernatural spectacle and everything to do with simple love transcending death. He thought of the Morales family, finding peace not through miraculous visitation, but through the assurance that death wasn't defeat. All of his most meaningful ministry had happened through ordinary human connection, heart speaking to heart across the chasm of loss. The stone grew hot in his hand, eager to fulfill its ultimate purpose. Michael closed his eyes and saw what would happen if he released its power. The souls around him would finally pass into whatever came next, their messages somehow transmitted across dimensions to reach their loved ones in dreams, in moments of stillness, in the subtle ways the spiritual world touched the physical. The barrier Cain had built around this place would crumble, and the natural order of death and resurrection would be restored. But he would lose the ability to see them go. He would lose the concrete proof that love survived physical ending. He would return to ministering to the grieving with only hope to offer, instead of certainty. That's faith, he whispered, understanding flooding through him. That's what faith actually means. Believing in resurrection without needing to see it. Trusting in love without requiring proof. Cain lunged forward, shadow talons reaching for Michael's throat, but it was too late. Michael opened his hand and spoke a single word, "Go." The stone exploded in light that turned the world white. For an instant that felt like eternity, Michael experienced every emotion the trapped souls had carried for 30 years, their love for the living, their urgent need to offer comfort, their desperate desire to say goodbye properly. The force of all that contained feeling, released at once, was overwhelming. But within the chaos, he felt individual connections being made. Sarah's love reaching his own heart with a finality that meant true farewell. Samuel's innocent joy touching families who'd lost children too young. Maria's maternal comfort flowing toward mothers still grieving decades-old losses. Dozens of other souls, their messages finally free to travel where they needed to go. Cain's scream of rage and defeat echoed across dimensions as his hold on the spirit snapped like brittle rope. The shadow priest's form began unraveling, pulled apart by forces he'd spent 3 decades trying to contain. But even as he dissolved, Michael felt something unexpected, not malice, but profound relief. Even Cain, in his final moments, was being freed from the prison of despair he'd built around himself. The light faded. The sudden silence was absolute, broken only by Michael's ragged breathing and the whisper of wind through grass. The clearing was empty. No souls, no shadows, no supernatural presence of any kind. The wooden cross stood unmarked by frost, weathered but peaceful in the morning sun. In his palm lay only fragments of ordinary stone, their power completely spent. Michael felt the supernatural sensitivity that had awakened in San Miguel drain away like water from a broken vessel. The veil between worlds had closed, perhaps forever. But as he knelt in the empty clearing, something else settled into place. A peace deeper than supernatural certainty, a faith that didn't require proof to sustain itself. He had given up his greatest gift to fulfill his highest calling. The cost of victory was the very ability that had made victory possible. And somehow that felt exactly right. Michael remained kneeling in the empty clearing for what felt like hours, though the sun's position suggested only minutes had passed. The fragments of stone in his palm were nothing more than ordinary granite now. Grey, cold, lifeless. No supernatural warmth, no pulse of otherworldly energy, just broken pieces of mountain rock that could have come from anywhere. The silence was profound in a way that felt almost musical. For weeks, he'd grown accustomed to the subtle vibration of spirits moving between worlds, the barely audible whisper of voices calling from beyond the veil. Now there was only wind through pine needles, the distant cry of a hawk, the natural sounds of a world that suddenly seemed complete unto itself. Standing slowly, Michael brushed dirt from his knees and let the stone fragments fall through his fingers. They scattered into the grass with tiny clicking sounds, and he felt no urge to gather them again. Whatever power they'd once held was gone, spent utterly in that moment of blazing release. The thought should have filled him with loss. He'd voluntarily given up the ability to see between worlds, to carry messages from the dead, to offer grieving families concrete proof that death wasn't the end. Instead, he felt lighter than he had in months. The walk back to his car took on the quality of a meditation. Each step felt deliberate, purposeful, as if he were walking into a future that finally made sense. The autumn air was crisp without being harsh, carrying the scent of pine and dying leaves. Normal autumn air, with no supernatural charge, no hint of other dimensions bleeding through. It was beautiful in its ordinariness. As he drove down the winding mountain road towards Santa Fe, Michael found himself thinking not about what he'd lost, but about what he'd gained. The desperate, clawing need to prove his faith through miraculous intervention was gone. In its place sat something steadier, a confidence that didn't require external validation. He'd stood against ultimate despair and chosen hope. He'd sacrificed his greatest gift to serve something larger than himself. The man who'd caused his sister's death had become someone capable of freeing dozens of souls from decades of suffering. That transformation hadn't come through supernatural power. It had come through the oldest miracle of all, resurrection through suffering, meaning discovered in the midst of loss. His phone buzzed with a text message as he reached the outskirts of town. "Father Rodriguez," Mrs. Patterson called. "Says she had the most beautiful dream last night. Her husband came to visit, told her he was proud of the woman she'd become after his death. She wanted you to know she's finally ready to start that grief support group we discussed. Amazing what peace can do for people." Michael pulled over and stared at the message, his heart hammering. Mrs. Patterson hadn't seen him use any supernatural ability. She'd simply received comfort from a dream, but comfort that carried the exact message her deceased husband had been desperate to deliver. Somehow, in ways beyond his understanding, the stone's final release had reached across dimensions to touch the living world. Another text arrived, then another. The Morales family writing to say their grandmother had appeared to them in their sleep, radiating joy and urging them to celebrate her life rather than mourn her passing. A young mother reporting that her stillborn daughter had somehow communicated peace and love through a dream so vivid it felt more real than waking. The messages of the freed souls were reaching their destinations, not through his intervention, but through the mysterious ways that love always found a path between hearts. Michael sat in his parked car, laughing and weeping simultaneously as message after message arrived. His congregation was experiencing an outpouring of comfort and healing that had nothing to do with his supernatural abilities and everything to do with the simple truth he'd fought so hard to accept: love transcended every boundary, including death itself. The priest who would return to St. Augustine's tomorrow would be fundamentally different from the broken man who'd fled 3 weeks ago. Not because he'd gained extraordinary powers, but because he'd learned to trust in ordinary resurrection, the daily miracle of hope surviving despair, meaning emerging from chaos, love proving stronger than loss. He no longer needed to see spirits to know they existed. He no longer required supernatural proof to believe in eternal life. Faith, he understood now, wasn't about certainty. It was about choosing hope in the midst of uncertainty, about trusting in redemption even when redemption seemed impossible. As the sun climbed higher over the Sangre de Cristo mountains, Michael started his car and turned toward home. Behind him, the wooden cross stood weathered and peaceful in its clearing, no longer a bridge between worlds but something better, a simple symbol pointing toward the truth that love never really died, that every ending contained the seed of new beginning. The supernatural chapter of his ministry was over. The truly miraculous chapter was about to begin. The return. The drive home took 14 hours, but Michael experienced each mile as a prayer. The landscape shifted gradually from New Mexico's high desert to Texas plains to Louisiana bayous, and with each change he felt himself settling deeper into the man he'd become. The priest who'd fled St. Augustine's 3 weeks ago had been running from responsibility, drowning in guilt, desperate for proof that redemption was possible. The man returning carried those same scars, but wore them differently, not as badges of shame, but as evidence of survival. He pulled into the church parking lot just as evening mass was ending. Through the stained glass windows, he could see the familiar silhouettes of his congregation rising for the final hymn. Mrs. Chen's distinctive profile as she helped her elderly mother stand. The Dubois family clustered together in their usual third pew. Father Rodriguez's gestures as he offered the closing blessing. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, carrying ordinary griefs and hopes. It was the most beautiful sight he'd ever witnessed. Michael sat in his car until the last parishioner had left, then walked slowly toward the rectory. The key felt strange in his hand, too normal, too mundane after weeks of supernatural encounters. But as he stepped inside, the familiar sense of coffee and old books embraced him like a homecoming he hadn't known he needed. Father Rodriguez emerged from the kitchen, his face cycling through surprise, relief, and barely contained questions. "Michael, thank God, we've been—" "I know." Michael set down his traveling bag and really looked at his colleague, the worry lines around his eyes, the careful way he held himself, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might cause his friend to disappear again. "I'm sorry, Eduardo. I'm sorry I left without explanation." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the weight of 3 weeks hanging between them. Then Rodriguez stepped forward and pulled Michael into an embrace that spoke of friendship tested but not broken. "The parish, they've been asking about you," Rodriguez said quietly. "I told them you were taking time for spiritual renewal. It seemed to be the truth, even if I didn't understand what kind." Michael nodded, thinking of dreams and stone fragments and souls finally set free, the truest kind. Over dinner, he tried to explain where he'd been without mentioning supernatural encounters or ancient crosses or shadow priests. Instead, he spoke of learning to trust in resurrection without needing to witness it, of discovering that faith meant choosing hope precisely when hope seemed impossible. Rodriguez listened with the patience of a confessor, asking few questions, allowing Michael to find his own words for transformation that defied easy description. "You're different," Rodriguez observed as they cleared the dishes, settled somehow. "When you left, you were carrying the weight of the world. Now you just look present." "I learned that I don't have to carry anything except what's mine to bear," Michael said. "The rest, The proof, the certainty, the need to fix everyone's pain, that was never my responsibility. The next morning, he celebrated his first Mass in 3 weeks. As he stood before the congregation, seeing faces he'd known for years, he felt the absence of supernatural sensitivity like a phantom limb. No spirits hovering around grieving families, no sense of messages waiting to be delivered from beyond the veil. Just people, beautifully, imperfectly human people, gathered to worship and find meaning in the midst of ordinary existence. Mrs. Patterson caught him after the service, her face radiant in a way he'd never seen before. "Father, I had to tell you, I'm ready to start that grief support group now. I had this dream, this incredible dream where Thomas visited me. He told me I was exactly who he'd always hoped I'd become, that my strength after his death had been his greatest pride. I woke up knowing I was meant to help other widows find that same peace." Michael felt his throat tighten with gratitude. "That sounds like exactly the kind of dream Thomas would send you." She studied his face carefully. "You say that like you really believe it." "I do," he said, surprised by how easily the words came. "I believe love finds a way to reach us, even across death. I believe our grief can become a bridge to hope for others. I believe in resurrection, not just the theological concept, but the daily reality of meaning emerging from loss." As Mrs. Patterson walked away to corner other potential group members, Michael realized this was what his ministry was meant to be, not miraculous intervention, but ordinary presence, not supernatural proof, but faithful witness to the possibility of hope surviving despair. He thought of Maria and Samuel, finally at peace wherever souls journeyed after letting go. He thought of Sarah, her love reaching him one last time before moving into whatever came next. He thought of the cross standing weathered and empty in its mountain clearing, no longer a bridge between worlds, but a reminder that some truths required no proof beyond the choosing to believe them. The broken priest who'd fled in guilt had returned as someone capable of offering comfort without requiring certainty. It was, Michael understood, exactly the kind of resurrection the world needed most, the new beginning. 6 months later, Michael stood in the parish hall watching Mrs. Patterson facilitate her 3rd grief support group meeting. The circle of chairs held 8 people tonight, more than had ever gathered for such a purpose at St. Augustine's. A young father whose wife had died in childbirth, an elderly man grieving his brother, a teenager who'd lost her best friend in a car accident. Each face carried the particular weight of loss, but also something else, a tentative openness to the possibility that their pain might eventually transform into purpose. "The dreams don't make the grief disappear," Mrs. Patterson was saying, her voice steady with earned wisdom. "But they remind us that love doesn't end just because physical presence does. Whether you believe those dreams are actual visitations or your heart's way of processing loss doesn't matter. What matters is letting them guide you toward healing." Michael leaned against the doorway, remembering his desperate need for supernatural proof, his conviction that faith required miraculous validation. The man who'd wept at an ancient cross, demanding God show himself, seemed like a stranger now. This ministry, watching broken people slowly discover their capacity to help others through similar darkness, felt infinitely more sacred than any supernatural encounter. After the group disbanded, Mrs. Patterson approached him with a familiar, determined expression. "Father, I've been thinking, what if we expanded this? Not just grief support, but a broader ministry for people in crisis, a place where doubt is welcome, where questions don't need immediate answers. What would you call something like that?" She smiled. "The resurrection ministry. Because sometimes you have to die to who you were before you can become who you're meant to be." Walking home through the familiar streets of his parish, Michael found himself thinking about transformation, not the dramatic, lightning-strike variety he'd once craved, but the quieter metamorphosis that happened through daily choices. Choosing hope over despair, choosing service over self-pity, choosing to trust in mysteries that couldn't be solved, only lived. His phone buzzed with a text from Father Rodriguez's "Young woman here asking for you." Says her son has been talking about visiting his grandmother in his dreams. Wants to know if such things are possible. Michael smiled, quickening his pace. These conversations came regularly now. People seeking not proof of supernatural intervention, but permission to hope that death wasn't ultimate defeat. He'd learned to meet them where they were, offering neither false certainty nor empty comfort, but something more valuable, witness to the possibility that love transcended every boundary. At the church, he found Rodriguez in the sanctuary with a woman in her 30s, her eyes red with recent tears. A boy of perhaps 5 sat beside her, coloring quietly in a children's Bible. "Mrs. Hamilton, this is Father Hartley," Rodriguez said gently. "He's had some experience with unusual spiritual encounters." Michael sat across from them, remembering his own desperate need for answers, his sister's death, the crushing weight of guilt that had driven him to that mountain clearing. "Tell me about your mother." The story emerged slowly. A grandmother who died of cancer 2 months prior, a little boy who claimed she visited him in dreams, bringing comfort and telling stories about heaven. Mrs. Hamilton struggled between dismissing the claims as childhood imagination and desperately wanting to believe her mother had found a way to reach across death. "I don't know what to think," she whispered. "Part of me needs it to be real. Part of me is afraid I'm losing my mind for even considering it." Michael knelt beside the boy's chair. "What does your grandmother tell you in these dreams?" The child looked up with serious brown eyes. "She says she's not hurt anymore, and she says Mommy is doing a good job being brave." Mrs. Hamilton's breath caught. Those were the exact words her mother had spoken during her final hospital stay, a private conversation the boy had never heard. "Does it matter if the dreams are real?" Michael asked gently. "Does it matter whether your mother is actually visiting or your son's heart is processing grief through the language of dreams? Either way, comfort is being offered. Either way, love is finding a path through loss." He watched understanding dawn in her eyes. Not the blinding certainty he'd once craved, but something steadier. Peace that didn't require proof to sustain itself. Later that evening, Michael climbed to the church bell tower, a ritual he'd developed since returning from New Mexico. The view encompassed his entire parish, houses where families gathered around dinner tables, apartments where lonely people found solace in prayer, streets where ordinary saints performed daily resurrections of hope. He no longer saw spirits or received supernatural visions. The veil between worlds remained opaque, requiring faith rather than offering proof. But in losing his supernatural abilities, he discovered something more valuable, the capacity to help others trust in mysteries beyond understanding, to believe in redemption without requiring evidence, to choose hope precisely because hope seemed impossible. The broken priest who'd fled in guilt 6 months ago had died somewhere on that mountain. In his place stood someone capable of ordinary ministry, presence without proof, comfort without certainty, faith that required no validation beyond the choosing to believe. Below him, the parish slept peacefully, trusting tomorrow would bring new opportunities for resurrection. Michael smiled, understanding finally that this was miracle enough.